Last designated speaker of the day is Sharada Srinivasan, Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Gender Justice and Development, Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, in Canada. Go ahead, Sharada.
Thanks, Amu. It's going to be really a tough act following Akila and Bharati Sharma, after what they have said in the last half an hour. So I want to begin by thanking Prajnya for including me in this conversation. And it's been a while since I actually looked back at one of the papers that I wrote, which is specifically about the changing nature of dowry in Tamil Nadu. I used Tamil Nadu as my case study. So this conversation, this invitation actually gave me the opportunity to go back and look at the paper because I've been asked to speak about what explains the persistence or even worsening of the practice of dowry in spite of the law. It might have its weaknesses, but still it's quite an effective tool if it were to be used effectively. So I did go back to the paper, and honestly, when I looked at the paper, I said, what has changed, right? This. So it's pretty much what I had written in. This was published in 2005 and based on fieldwork in 2001 and 2 in Salem district in Tamil Nadu. And this was part of the larger question of how practices like female infanticide come to happen in Tamil Nadu, which were earlier where it just didn't happen, right? So as part of that research, I did look at how the changing nature of dowry is one of the key factors in explaining the rise of discrimination against daughters, and one of the forms that this discrimination manifested itself was in their elimination. So I think it's useful for me to begin with reading the abstract of the paper. And please bear in mind, this was fieldwork done in 2001-2, and the paper was published in 2005. And the paper itself is based on ethnographic fieldwork that I undertook in one of the villages in Salem district. Significant changes have occurred in the practice of dowry in South India. From being an upper caste class practice, dowry has become an all caste class phenomenon, replacing the symbolic exchange of gifts between families of the groom and the bride. It has become a euphemism for strategies to acquire higher standards of material life, status, and security, with negative consequences to women's status, including their survival. The anti-female bias of the practice cannot be tackled from within the dowry trap. Raising the critical consciousness of women about their identity and self-esteem remains a critical component of effective strategies. So, I asked myself, okay, 15, 20 years later, what has changed? I could very well be writing that paper now, and I think the abstract would pretty much be the same. So what I'm going to try and do in the remaining 12 minutes or so is really talk about 3 points. First is the sort of manifestation, the current manifestation of dowry, because I think that context needs to be established before we talk about how this has come about and how do we get out of it. And most of what I'm going to say is not going to be new, especially to this quite well-informed audience. But I think it's a key reminder of how embedded and how immersed all of us are in some of these processes that keep practices such as dowry alive, right? It's a good reminder that that's what makes it so hard to say, let's get rid of it, and tomorrow you wake up and it is gone. So that's why it is so challenging to get rid of a practice like dowry. So just to start with talking about what the current situation of dowry is. If 60 years later, we are talking about the ineffectiveness of a law, it just tells me that that a practice like dowry simply cannot thrive without the collusion and involvement of women and their families. So please bear with me. I'm not throwing all of the responsibility onto women and their families, but there is a way in which the groom and their families and women and their families are all colluded and involved in keeping this practice alive, right? So what is dowry? Quite different from what Akila laid out as the definition in the law. In common parlance, whether it is in the North or in the South, people understand it to be substantive gifts that are given at the time of wedding, but also customary gifts that are given throughout the woman's life and that of her children. So, so while the law itself talks about only wedding-related gifts, the practice in common parlance, the understanding is dowry is what you keep giving to a daughter's marital family throughout her life and even beyond her life for her children. So these are gifts from the girl's family to the groom. Often people say, "Oh, it's the opposite of bride price." It is not the opposite of bride price. In bride price, the directions, whereas in dowry, both the woman and the gifts move in one direction towards the groom and their family. While there is considerable, it's quite common that the jewelry actually belongs to the woman. In reality, she may not have much independent control over the jewelry. Of what she decides to do or not to do with the jewelry is often not her own autonomous decision. And again, in common parlance, and in policy circles, and among many parliamentarians and others, it's often seen as a substitute for inheritance. It is not a substitute for women's property rights or inheritance. And I think this needs to be established clearly, because the way out of all of this is really to strengthen women's property rights and inheritance. That is really the way to to be fighting dowry, because, like I said, we cannot fight dowry by being within the dowry trap, right? We have to give dowry so that our daughter will have a happy life. She has to be married. Chalo, so let's give dowry. And then I can't go on campaigning against dowry. These two things don't really happen. So the one clear way that legally it is now possible is the amendment of the Hindu inheritance, so which allows for daughters to equally inherit ancestral property. So that, I think, is really the key to counter the practice of dowry. And I'm very well aware that this is easier said than done, because even today people say, the women themselves say, look, I got so much of jewelry during my wedding. So my brother needs to have this little plot of land, and he has his own family and mouths to feed. So it would be unfair on my part to demand a share in that piece of land. But then the thing really is to say, I do not want jewelry. I do want a piece of that land, because I'm sure all of you by now know the value of real estate in India or in any part of the world. So it doesn't compare with the value of gold. Okay, having said that, the next thing I want to really emphasize, and I think Bharati explained that quite forcefully through the example of the cases that Shakti Shalini deals with. Dowry is not simply a gift. It is a strategy for status mobility, which is engaged by grooms, their families, as well as women and their families. So it's no longer limited to grooms and their families. And it is not an explicit demand of you have to do so many things for us, but these are all really a play on people's emotions and really enticing the consumer in people. And the way a lot of this is played along is really along two lines. First is what again Bharati very nicely articulated, is this thing of, we are asking for all of this because ultimately it is your daughter and her family that are going to enjoy these benefits. So this is one line that is often used. The second line that is often used is of course where there are brothers, also cousins, the groom's family saying, so and so did so much and so much. So somewhere there is a huge pressure on the women and their families to either match up what has already been done, and even better, to beat what dowry has been brought by the older brother or somebody else in the family, right? So it is also a way of, dowry is also a way of then demonstrating that that this is a competitive way of demonstrating and asserting the woman's status in the marital household. But does it really mean that the younger daughter-in-law is that just because she brings a larger dowry, does she have more of a say in the household? Yes and no. And I'm happy to answer that question if it comes up in the Q&A, because we did some work around that, the relationship between dowry and domestic violence, which I'm happy to talk about. In effect, there are hierarchies of dowry. So we cannot homogenize all men, we cannot homogenize all women, and nor can we homogenize all dowries, right? So that again, I will come back to in talking about how did we get to this situation. Now, very often in North India, but also in some parts of Tamil Nadu where I've done field work, people have always said, there is a shortage of brides because of the practice of sex-selective abortion or daughter elimination, and this would lead to a decline in dowry. And none more than someone like Madhu Keshwar, has actually talked about these things. But no, the shortage of brides and the demand for dowry actually operate on really parallel tracks. So the demand for high status grooms has not gone down, right? And therefore, if you need a high status groom, it means you have to be willing to give a higher dowry. And this is where women and their families, once women have had some level of education, if it is a undergraduate degree or a MCOM or a doctor's medical degree, then it's like, I need to be married to a medical doctor, or the family thinks the daughter has to be married to a medical doctor. And there is a price attached to this medical doctor groom. And so what we are seeing is really the shortage of brides and the demand for high status grooms actually operating along parallel tracks. And this is hypergamy, right? Because women always want to marry up. And people have resorted to evolutionary biology to explain that that this is not a social behavior. This is sort of a natural behavior. And of course, we have to be very, very careful going down this dangerous path on insisting that women marrying higher up is a natural behavior. I think it is a social behavior. It is a learned behavior. The other thing that has changed the current context is weddings, especially in South India, are no longer a one event or a one-day affair. Now I think middle-class weddings pretty much are a 3-day event. with Sangeet and Mehendi and things like that into Tamil weddings. So I'm talking about Tamil Nadu. And these events are often held at different venues, again, showing the sort of the status of both the girl's family and the groom's family. No, events like Sangeet and Mehendi were not part of Tamil weddings, and these are recent additions. Even when I did my field work in 2000, 2005, nobody talked about Sangeet and Mehendi. I have now attended a couple of weddings in my family, and of course, there is the Sangeet, there is the Mehendi, there are all sorts of things that are added to this, and so it is discomforting to see such extravagant, ostentatious events. And of course, we all know one of the things that's increasingly happening is what's called the destination weddings. Again, this middle class, upper middle class, really talking about how do we get out of and make the wedding the one-time event in our life really memorable, right? And that's the other emotional string that's played along. Should we be spending so much? I might not wear this sari or this dress beyond that one event, but it is exactly the same thing, right? You're going to be doing it only once in your lifetime, so why not, right? So that emotional tug you see in advertisements, in the way families, friends, and everybody puts pressure on the groom and the bride to engage in this sort of extravagant behavior. The demand for gold at the personal level has simply not declined. It has intensified. India is the largest consumer of gold at the individual level, and that is not about to wane at all. And gone are the days when men and grooms and their families were solely the ones who were making the demands, either directly or through relatives or through friends or through the marriage broker. Now, women themselves are at the forefront of actually wanting ostentatious weddings, the demand for goods, and extravagant lifestyles. This is not all women. So this brings me to the second part of my presentation, which is how has all this come about? And again, no surprises at all. It is two things that are happening simultaneously, or let's say three things that are happening simultaneously in countries like India. And let's focus on what's happening in India. First is the exceptional rise in consumerism and the availability of consumer goods. The second is rising aspirations, partly through the opening up of the economy, being exposed to all sorts of things on television, on films, through social media. And social media by far today has the biggest influence, and people are able to get a lot of information at their fingertip. A lot of this information is useful, but a lot of this information is also harmful. So it is consumerism, rising aspirations in the context of widening inequality. And we don't talk much about inequality, right? The top 10% of Indian population holds 77% of total national wealth. 73% of the wealth generated in 2017 went to the richest 1%, while 67 million Indians who comprise the poorest half of the population saw only a 1% increase in their wealth. This is an Oxfam report on inequality. So when Ambani is celebrating his daughter's wedding, please let's not use that as a model to talk about how, in their wedding, they actually brought all the arts and crafts, the artists and craft makers, and had a Dilli Haath kind of a thing where, these craftsmen, the craftspeople, and artists were able to sell their produce directly to people like, the Clinton, Hillary Clintons of the world, right? So that cannot be used as a model or a way to to actually emulate. And while lack of income is an important aspect, how do we meet aspirations? Every company, every product comes with a loan, EMIs, making consumption of expensive goods seemingly affordable, but this only traps people into a lifelong debt crisis. So I think this is sort of something that I think is really I mean, nothing new to anyone who is listening to this presentation. But there is very little focus on how personal lifestyles, consumption contributes to increased violence against women, or threat against or the threat of plastic and clothing and the connection to global warming, right? In the West, these things are beginning to happen, but we don't see any of this in our education system, whether at the school education or at the university education. The emphasis is so much really on how can you as an individual be successful, and that is really by getting better grades and a better job, and if possible, settling abroad or getting a higher income in India. So creating that little bubble around you so you can really be oblivious of what's happening around us. And the one point that I want to really emphasize here is women's empowerment. In the last 2 decades, we have seen enormous increases in women's education levels. And in many universities and schools, women outnumber men and boys in terms of their enrollment. And in South India, in the areas where I do field work, and in Punjab, women are able to say, they do have a say in marriage of who I can marry or who I do not want to marry. So this idea of empowerment is actually working. So the ability to exercise choice or the expansion of choices is actually happening. But a lot of these are actually driving dowry, especially in the middle class and those living in urban areas. Those who can afford often think that it is their right and there is nothing wrong in giving dowry. I mean, what's wrong if we can give it? This creates enormous pressure to imitate among those who have less, and it makes it extremely difficult for them to actually get out. So the last point that I want to make is, how do we change this? The first point is what I made at the start is really how do we promote and strengthen women's inheritance rights? So dowry is not seen as a substitute for inheritance. The second aspect is this notion that daughters are a burden and that they have to be handed over from parents to a husband. That notion has to change among parents, among daughters themselves, and of course, among fathers and men. And this, of course, needs that we work with men as well. And without working with men, and I think in this audience, I probably saw maybe one man in the audience. So I think there is work to be done at all levels, but the education system has changed in a way that is unrecognizable from the time that I was in school. But I think the education system also has to really balance between individual liberalism and collective responsibility. And I will stop here. Thank you.